Hello, this is Socially Triggered, and this video is going to be about Vox's The Myth of Race Debunked in 3 minutes. Basically, I'm going to debunk the debunking of race. So, Vox came out with this very interesting video. It's 3 minutes long, so at least it's not too tedious that they go on for a long time, unlike my videos, which go on forever. This video is interesting because it basically ignores the whole concept of race and tries to, do the stereotypical liberal thing where they say, oh, race isn't real because it's a social construct. And I'm going to play their video in its entirety, and I'm going to stop it when I want to interject some, feedback. And I don't want to destroy the conversation by doing so. I just want to capture the essence of their mistakes or the fallacies and the arguments that they're trying to present. So let's listen to their video and take it from there.
You may think you know exactly what race you are, but how would you prove it if someone disagreed with you? The fact is, even though race drives a lot of social and political outcomes, race isn't real.
So the first thing they say is race isn't real. They just assert that immediately. So with no evidence. They're going to get into the evidence soon, but they just immediately say race isn't real. Everything you've been told, there are no races. It's all just a myth. Okay, so let's listen to their arguments.
One of the first people to attempt to categorize humans according to race was a German scientist around 1776.
So the German scientist that they mention is a very interesting one. His name is Johann Frederick Blumenbach. And he's a very interesting man. He's a bit of a racist because he did believe in white superiority over people from Africa. However, that does not you can't just use that as a means to dismiss what he says, because he actually does come up with some reasonable early scientific ideas. And the thing with science, one thing that we really need to understand is that science is a progression. It's not somebody coming up with the correct answer the first shot. It's a progression where people are building on ideas of others, and we gradually tune it until we get a better answer of what the real situation is. We find truth from getting approximations of what that right answer is. So what did he believe? He believed that there was 5 main races. He had the Caucasian race, which was the white race, the Mongolian race, which was the yellow race, which includes East Asians and Central Asians. He had the Malayan race, which is the brown race, which includes Southeast Asians and Pacific Islanders. And then he had the Ethiopian race, which was the black race. And that includes all of sub-Saharan Africans. Then he had the American race, or the red race. And that's all the American Indians. So those are the 5 major races that he defined. And let's go back into Vox and see what they say about that.
He came up with 5 different groups according to physical appearance and geographic origin of their ancestors. Americans of European descent eagerly bought into this type of thinking around the same time. Some historians have said the idea that there were different races helped them resolve the contradiction between a natural right to freedom and the fact of slavery. If whites were their own distinct category, then they could feel a lot better about denying freedom to people who they labeled black and decided were fundamentally different.
So that is true. Early adopters of this idea did use it, the concept of race, incorrectly, where they basically used it as a way to deny rights to other groups. that still doesn't discredit the concept of race. It just says that race can be used negatively. So far, Vox hasn't really disproven the concept of race. They just said that it can be used negatively. So I just want that to be understood. Now let's continue their video.
But as political priorities change, definitions of race in America adjust right along with them. For example, if you were of Mexican birth or ancestry in the United States in 1929, you were considered white. Then the 1930 census changed that to non-white to limit immigration. Later, when the U.S. needed to increase its labor force during World War II, these people were switched back to white. And what it took to be black once varied so wildly throughout.
Okay, just back. They're still using these arguments of how race can be used incorrectly as a means to discredit the concept of race. Now, with the case of Mexicans, they're a very interesting group because they are actually a mixture of two groups. They're a mixture of the native population of the Americas, the South America, and the Americas, with Spanish whites. So you get like sort of a mixture, and they can be, some have a greater mixture of the indigenous people, and some have a greater mixture of Spanish ancestry. So they are kind of one of those groups where you can sort of classify them as white one day and then classify them as something else the next day. And that can be done for political reasons, and it was done in the U.S. for political reasons. When they want to curtail too much immigration, they can say, oh, sorry, you're not white anymore. We won't let you in. But that still doesn't discredit the concept of race. So let's continue the video. Now they're going to talk about the blacks in America.
Throughout the country, from 1/4 to 1/16 to the infamous one drop of African ancestry, that people could actually change races just by crossing state lines. Then suddenly in 2000, the government decided that Americans could be more than one race and added a multiracial category to the census. This has left many Americans scratching their heads when it comes to selecting.
So this was kind of interesting. The 2000 census was very interesting. It was actually an attempt to be actually politically correct. They were trying to give people more selection in terms of race. Because when you look at race, you can actually divide it. Like we have the 5 major races, but you can actually divide it into smaller groups. And there is a lot of evidence to consider that you can maybe divide things into smaller groups. Like the African race can be divided into smaller groups because there's just so much variation within Africa in terms of the genetic variation. The same goes for the East Islanders versus Asians of Southeast Asians versus Southwestern Asians and so forth. So there's a lot of variation within the Asian, because Asia is huge. Within the Asian population, you can divide it into many groups. So the census, though, was kind of a failed attempt because what happened was it created all these classifications, but then it was people got confused by it because you have white, you have black African, you have African Indian, American Indian, or Alaskan Native, and then you have Asian Indian, Chinese, Filipino, other Asian, Japanese, Korean, Vietnamese, Native Hawaiian. Okay, so you have all these different groups. But then some people are mixed. For example, my kids are mixed. My wife is Korean. I'm Canadian. So I'm white. We're mixed. And my kids are mixed. So which box should they check? Should they check the Korean box or should they check some other race? And there's other groups that actually wouldn't classify themselves as any of these groups that are listed here. So you'll have like people from like the Aborigines in Australia. They wouldn't be able to classify themselves as any of these groups because they would see themselves as being different. And genetically they are. They would actually be their own subgroup. So what they're going to talk about next, I'll let it play.
Who they are. As many as 6.2% of census respondents selected some other race in a 2010 survey.
So they say 6.2% classified themselves as something other than what was on the census. But you would expect that because, you get all these mixed races. You get people that weren't in those brackets. The fact that they divided Asians up into like Korean, Japanese, and so forth. Well, what if you're not? What if you're Mongolian? What if you're some other Asian group? Well, then you're going to be like, there's why they get classified, but I don't, so there is that difference that people will be like, hey, I don't see myself being represented in these questions. So they're going to check something else. And 6%, not a big group of people. It's more people spoil ballots when they do voting. So it's not that bad, but it shows that the census had some flaws with it. And they did come out with better censuses later. So it's just important to know that they realized that they made mistakes and that they improved upon it later.
The idea that someone might look one way and identify another way, or that they might be really hard to place in a racial category, is not new. This is why there was a public debate about whether MSNBC's Karen Finney could say she was black, or how we can't even agree on the racial label assigned to the president of the...
So they're getting into the fact that we couldn't identify Obama as white or black or whatever. So that's kind of an interesting thing. Obama is actually, if you want to look at his genetics, he's actually less black than he is white. His mother was white. His father was mixed, black and Arabic. I think it's Arab. So he's mixed with only a percentage of being black, a greater percentage of being white. So some people would classify him as a white president, where others would take that one drop philosophy and say, hey, he's got some African in him. He's obviously black. So there is that kind of debate about his whiteness or blackness, and it depends who you ask. Some people would say, hey, it depends on what their worldview is. But genetically speaking, he would fit into that multiracial category. So it's just kind of an interesting one. It still doesn't disprove race. It just shows that, you can have mixed people.
United States. Of course, many people feel their racial identity is very clear and very permanent. But the fact that some people have changed theirs and that no one can really argue with them shows how shaky the very idea of race is. This is all because there isn't a race chromosome.
Okay. So first thing that this is just getting into the Salinas Factor here. So the first thing that they say is that people can switch their racial category and nobody can deny them. Well, that's more of political correctness rather than actual real ability to switch your race. People claim to be something that they are not, and nowadays people just accept it because nowadays everybody can be whatever they want or identify as, which is not necessarily, doesn't make it real. Just because you decide that you're one day black and the next day white, well, your body doesn't work that way. Genes don't work that way. And the next point they're going to make is to go further and say, hey, there's no gene that defines one person as being white or black or whatever. Well, that's actually a lie. There are actually multiple genes that are used as markers or phenotypes which can identify a person's race. There's a lot of genetic markers that are used to identify race. And actually, as you use more markers, you can actually identify races very, very clearly. So the next part is just a complete lie. So let's watch it.
in our DNA that people can point to. It simply doesn't exist. When the medical community links race to health outcomes, it's really just using race as a substitute for other factors, such as where your ancestors came from, or the experiences of people who may have been put in the same racial group as you. Dorothy Roberts explains that sickle cell anemia is a prime example of this. The disease is linked to areas with high rates of malaria, which include some parts of Europe and Asia in addition to Africa. It's not actually about race at all.
So this is kind of interesting because she says it's not about race, it's about where you're from. But where you're from, if you understand evolution at all, you'd understand that evolution is what determines, where you came from determines how you evolved. The environmental pressures that were put on your species or group determines how you become whatever you are. If you isolate groups of people and you take two groups and you that started out as being the same, and you break them apart and you put them in very different environments, they will actually evolve to suit those environments very differently. So if you separate them by 100,000 years, which we have with humans, you get the different races appearing. Not only that, did we have the situation where the Africans that moved out of Africa and into Europe, they encountered another group, another species actually, which was the Neanderthals. And those Neanderthals mixed with the Africans that were coming out of Africa. They gave them the blonde hair, the lighter skin. And also there was pressures within Europe that caused major genetic changes. Because if you look at the European environment, it's very different than Africa. It's colder. You have to, plan ahead for your food production. You have to. There was different pressures, and then there was also different food choices. So societies within Europe became much more food production. The food production was very different. They were into agriculture much more. They were into livestock. They were into different things that helped them to adapt to that environment. So there were significant pressures, environmentally speaking, that changed them. And this concept of that they're talking about here is actually the proof for evolution, for the evolution evidence of race, that you can tell where somebody is from based on their genetics and based on some of the diseases that impact them. So sickle cell anemia is a really good one because it mainly impacts people from Africa, because it was a disease mainly in Africa, and you can look at their genetics and you can see that they have that that they're more likely to suffer from it if they come from certain areas. So it's actually very important to know somebody's race, because then you can say, well, you might have these potential diseases that you have to watch out for. So race is actually a very important concept. So let's continue on.
This, of course, does not mean that the concept of race isn't hugely important in our lives. The racial categories to which we're assigned can determine real-life experiences, they can drive political outcomes, and they can even make the difference between life and death. But understanding that racial categories are made up can give us an important perspective on where racism came from in the first place.
So I'm not sure, but to me there was nothing in that video that really debunked the concept of race at all. I couldn't find it. If you can find it, tell me, because I didn't see anything within that video that debunked the concept of race. So please comment below. Give me tell me where is the smoking gun where they debunked race, because I didn't see it. I hope you like this video. This is Socially Triggered, and please like, comment, and subscribe. And I look forward to your feedback. Thank you.